We had a vote today on moving ahead to that legislation, and I supported that movement, the cloture vote. And I supported the cloture vote and will support the underlying budget agreement because it does take modest steps to reduce the deficit. It does so without raising taxes. It also relieves some of the sequester's worst impact on our national security. And it also prevents another government shutdown next month, but also next year. I also support it because it's time for us to have a budget around here. And we have not had a budget for 4 years. It will enable us to begin the process of having appropriations bills again. And in the appropriations process, of course, you have oversight over the federal departments and agencies, and you prioritize spending, which is really important. Among other things, this will give us the opportunity to root out some of the waste and fraud and actually determine what programs are working and not working to be able to use the power of the purse that Congress has to help be sure that taxpayer funds are being used efficiently and effectively. As members know here, this agreement was the culmination of what's called a budget conference committee between the House and the Senate. So it was Democrats and Republicans, but also the House and Senate coming together. That has not happened in 4 years. So we haven't had a budget in 4 years. We haven't had a budget conference in 4 years. And you think about that. Is it any wonder that during those 4 years, Congress has racked up historic debts and deficits? The deficits of the past 4 years have been the largest deficits in the history of our country. And one reason is we haven't had the discipline that comes with having a budget and being sure that there is some accountability for the spending. We haven't made the hard choices that our constituents have to make every day. How much to spend, what to spend it on, that's what a budget is supposed to do. Now, this budget agreement that will be voted on this week is far from perfect. There are a lot of things I don't like about it. In fact, I just supported the attempt to amend it here on the floor of the Senate to improve it. But I do believe that with a divided Congress, Republicans in charge in the House, Democrats in charge in the Senate, it was the best we could hope for. No tax increases, as the Democrats want it. We just heard from one of my colleagues talking about more taxes needed, but no tax increases in this budget agreement. Actual deficit reduction, although I will acknowledge the deficit reduction is way too small. It's about $22 billion in deficit reduction over 10 years compared to existing law. It does provide some sequester relief for the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense was facing across-the-board sequester cuts, which are kind of arbitrary across-the-board cuts of about $20 billion, starting on January 15th and over the next few months. This relief is very important to our military. We've heard from them. It's important to our readiness. It's important to our troops. It's important to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio and other bases around the country. It's important to our warfighters who around the globe tonight are putting their lives on the line for us. So I think that sequester relief for the Department of Defense that's in this budget agreement was important. While this might be the best two-year budget agreement that is imaginable in a time of divided government like we have, with all of the dysfunction here in this town, it is certainly not the comprehensive agreement that the American people deserve. Through this agreement, Congress has now accomplished really the bare minimum of what the American people should be able to expect from Congress. After all, Congress does have, as I said earlier, the power of the purse. That's in the Constitution. Every dime has to be appropriated by the United States Congress. We should be the ones determining how taxpayer dollars are spent. You certainly need a budget. There are some who took to the floor today and will tomorrow, I'm sure, who are going to say this is a great budget agreement. It's a sign of how Washington can work, how things get done, how we can come together to fix a problem. Fair enough. We avoided a government shutdown. And yes, we're not going to gut national security. And yes, we will have a small deficit reduction, again, about $22 billion. But let's be honest about the opportunity that Congress missed this week with this budget agreement. When it comes to the real, very real budget and fiscal problems we face as a country, when it comes to the mandatory spending, that's the 2/3 of the budget that's on autopilot. That's the part that's driving our country toward bankruptcy, threatening to undermine really important vital programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We've done nothing in this budget agreement, nothing on that side of the ledger. We've kicked the can down the road one more time, missed the opportunity. And as we all know, unless we address these fiscal problems, the day of reckoning is coming. This is a pie chart of federal spending that will kind of show you where we are relative to 1965, when mandatory spending, this is the part again that Congress does not appropriate every year, it's on autopilot, was 34% of the budget. Defense 43%, domestic discretionary 23%. Here's where we are today. Mandatory spending 66% of the budget, from 34% to 66%. And remember, this is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, also interest on the debt. By the way, defense spending has gone from 43% down to 18%. And yet the sequester takes most of the savings disproportionately out of defense, which is one reason this budget agreement was needed. So we've seen a big growth in the mandatory spending. And by the way, over the next 10 years, it goes from 66% to 76%. What does that mean? That means it crowds out discretionary spending. Defense spending, research spending, education spending, infrastructure spending, that's what's happening. So our deficits are going to record highs over the coming couple of decades, and mandatory spending is exploding, and it's squeezing the other spending in our budget. Over the next decade, the federal government's going to collect revenue of about $40 trillion, spend about $46 trillion, run a deficit of $6.3 trillion. Over the next 10 years, another $6.3 trillion on top of the $17 trillion debt. In that 10th year, by the way, 2023, the best case scenario has a projected deficit, annual deficit, of nearly $1 trillion, $895 billion for 1 year. And by the way, that assumes no wars. It assumes a decade of prosperity. It assumes 10 years of historically low interest rates. Quite a rosy scenario. If any of these factors fall through, things could be much, much worse, well over $1 trillion. And this is not a problem that can be solved by just cutting discretionary spending. Over the next 10 years, Washington will spend more than $22 trillion on these vital programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. If we were to cut our defense budget over the next decade all the way down to zero, have no defense spending at all, zero, we could pay for just 1/4 of that cost, of the $22 trillion. If we removed every penny of potentially identifiable waste in government, which we should do, by the way, and that's why we need to get back to appropriations, but if we did that, if we removed every penny of potentially identifiable waste in government, we could pay for less than 10% of this exploding cost on the mandatory side. If we pulled out of Iraq and Afghanistan today, ended all bailouts and corporate welfare, reversed the tax cuts for all Americans making less than $450,000 a year that we kept as part of the fiscal cliff agreement, if we repealed Obamacare altogether, if we did all those things, we'd cover just 20% of the cost of those programs, this $22 trillion. In other words, even if we wanted to try to do it by cutting this spending, we couldn't do it because there's not enough money in that part of the budget. So it's not just a matter of choosing spending priorities. And it's certainly not a matter of raising taxes. My colleague earlier talked about how we need to raise more taxes for different things, and I understand a lot of people are saying that. But let's be honest about this. It's a bad idea at a time of a weak economy to raise taxes anyway. Plus, over the next decade, you know what happens on taxes? Over the next decade, we're told by the Congressional Budget Office, taxes will be, as a percent of the economy, which is the way you ought to look at it, economists tell us, taxes will be at historically high levels. Historically high levels. So the economy is already weak. Tax revenues are headed toward their highest sustained levels in history. And when it comes to taxes, there's an alternative, which is let's reform the tax code. What we should be doing is restraining spending, reforming these vital but unsustainable programs, and also raising more revenue through growth. And economic growth can come through tax reform. That tax reform gives the economy a shot in the arm. It helps bring back the jobs. It increases revenue through growth. And that's why we need both entitlement reform and tax reform. The issue of entitlement reform is a tough one politically, and a lot of members of Congress are hesitant to touch it. It's called the third rail of American politics. That's the electrified rail in the New York subway system, where if you touch it, you're electrified. Let's start small. How about means testing of Medicare? This could be a first step in the right direction. Under Medicare, the average two-earner couple retiring today pays $119,000 in lifetime Medicare taxes and yet receives $350,000 in lifetime Medicare benefits. So $1 of taxes for $3 of benefits. That's how Medicare works. That's for the typical family in Ohio or around the country. When you multiply this by 77 million retiring baby boomers, you can see why we have a totally unsustainable program, because not enough money goes in to be able to pay for the benefits coming out. Providing $3 in benefits under Medicare for every $1 paid in taxes for low-income seniors is one thing. We want to be sure that low-income seniors are taken care of. For the most part, in their working years, those folks probably didn't earn enough income to pay large Medicare taxes. And the program is designed to ensure that they do receive the medical coverage they would not otherwise get. But should upper-income seniors who are on Medicare, receive benefits that far exceed what they pay into the system? That's what happens now. Is that fair? I don't think so when the program's going bankrupt, when our kids and grandkids are facing massive tax increases to pay for a problem that we all foresee and yet fail to correct. By the way, I tried in this latest budget agreement to say on the mandatory side of the ledger, why don't we deal with means testing of Medicare? That would have provided enough revenue to provide the relief on sequester. We wouldn't be doing things like TSA fees, wouldn't be doing things like reducing the benefits for our military. It was rejected. It was rejected. I talked to a number of Democrats about it who said we just can't touch that. We can't touch even means testing of Medicare without raising taxes. So in essence, raising taxes on the wealthy is necessary to reduce benefits for the wealthy. That's the point we're at. That's how tough it is. That's why we need a new approach. And that's why we need some leadership here in the House, the Senate, but also at the White House. We need a president willing to help us on this, to talk about it. Have you ever heard the president talk about the fact that there is $3 of benefits coming from Medicare for every dollar you put in? Have you heard him talk about the fact that entitlements are going to otherwise bankrupt the country? We need a little straight talk and an honest dialogue about this. If we do nothing, as we have done with this budget agreement before the Senate, with regard to mandatory spending, entitlement spending, and as we've done time and time again, the Social Security Disability Trust Fund will go bankrupt in 2016, a couple years from now. Medicare will follow in 2026. And again, every year, much more being paid out than being paid in. Social Security, already in a cash deficit, meaning there's more money coming out in terms of benefits than there is payroll taxes going in every year. But it will collapse, the trust fund will collapse in 2035. Medicaid has no trust fund, so it won't go bankrupt itself. It'll just continue to grow at unsustainable levels, helping to bankrupt the country, but also, in that case, it may take the states down with it. As states will tell you, it's generally their largest and fastest growing expense, is Medicaid. So these are issues that we must address. On the floor of this chamber, we often talk about the next generation. We hear speeches about protecting the elderly and ensuring every American gets the benefit of the bargain that was made when Social Security and Medicare came into being. I agree. But to do that, we need to improve and preserve these programs. And we need to stop blaming one another for what happened, because frankly, Republicans and Democrats alike are responsible for this. We have done one thing that is truly bipartisan in the last few decades, and that is we have overspent and we have overpromised, Republicans and Democrats alike. Because we helped create this mess together, we've got to work together to resolve it. With this vote on the budget this week, another budget crisis has passed, and that's good. We're on the road to avoiding another government shutdown in January and again next year. That's the most basic job of government, and I think that's good. And we got a little bit of deficit reduction, and we didn't raise taxes on a weak economy. But we need to aim higher. Perhaps in the context of the debt limit debate that's coming up in a matter of only a few months, we can get more serious about the underlying problem. Because it's that underlying problem that's driving our future deficits. We all know that. We all agree on that. We all know it has to be fixed. So let's do it this coming year. We've seen how divided government can achieve something important but small. That's what happens with this budget agreement this week. In 2014, next year, let's see how divided government can achieve something big and critical to economic growth and jobs and to the future of our children and grandchildren. That's our solemn responsibility here in the United States Congress, to ensure that we're leaving a better world to future generations. We cannot do this if we do not address this fiscal crisis.